Imagine a country where the economy officially hits the $2 billion mark,
Right.
and primary school enrollment completely shatters records, like breaking past 100%.
Which sounds impossible, but
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. And on top of that, massive international medical campaigns successfully slash the infant mortality rate.
It sounds like, an absolute triumph of modern development.
Right, like a textbook success story. But then uh, you look just a fraction of an inch below the surface of those glittering numbers.
And the reality is much darker.
Yeah, you realize that while enrollment is over 100%, there are actually over 100,000 children completely locked out of classrooms.
While the GDP is soaring, inflation is um, just entirely eroding the ability of families to buy basic food.
And the government is basically suffocating under a mountain of debt that prevents them from fixing any of it. So today, we are dismantling the ultimate macroeconomic illusion.
It is a really profound paradox. When you look at the development of a nation over, like, 6 decades, the headline numbers almost never tell the true story.
Never.
You really have to look at how the different layers of a society, the money, the people, the infrastructure, and the laws are grinding against each other.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. Welcome, everyone. We are thrilled you are joining us today.
Really glad to be here to unpack this.
So we are exploring a truly comprehensive, incredibly data-rich source you provided us. It's an empirical assessment of the multidimensional development and structural transformation of the Gambia.
Spanning from 1960 all the way to 2023.
Yes, and let me tell you, the visual aesthetic of the first slide you sent it immediately sets the tone.
It really does. Very minimalist.
Totally. Just pure white background, FFFFFF hex code with this stark, dark gray text and this light grid-like infographic at the bottom.
It signals right away that this deep dive is about rigorous, no-nonsense data. No flashy 3D effects, no flunk.
Exactly. It strips away the PR and looks purely at the unvarnished data, which brings us to the second slide you shared, the executive summary.
Right, the flowchart.
Yeah, it lays out this 4-module flowchart. 4 distinct text boxes connected by these dark gray one-way arrows.
Macroeconomic, population and health, educational capital, and institutional governance.
That's the one. And you pointed out that those arrows define a very specific narrative logic for the entire research, a massive domino effect.
Exactly. The logic flows like this. Massive population pressure leads directly to struggles in accumulating domestic capital.
Right.
And then that lack of capital hits severe structural and industrial bottlenecks, which ultimately culminates in and is exacerbated by deeply rooted governance challenges.
So it's population pressure to capital struggles to structural bottlenecks to governance challenges.
Yes. If you understand that exact sequence, you understand the engine driving this entire 60-year history.
Okay, so let's jump right into the first domino then. The macroeconomic trajectory on slide 3. Let's look at the money.
The growth illusion.
Yeah, because the data you provided shows absolute GDP in current US dollars on this dual axis chart. The dark blue line just climbs and climbs.
From tens of millions in the early years to crossing the $1 billion and then the $2 billion mark recently.
Right. If I am, an international investor just glancing at a Bloomberg terminal, that looks like a steady, triumphant march upward.
It looks incredibly seductive. But absolute GDP growth in developing nations often acts as a smokescreen.
A smokescreen for what?
Well, it masks severe underlying economic fragility because GDP is simply a measure of the total value of goods and services produced.
Right.
It doesn't actually tell you what that money can buy on the ground for an average person.
And that brings us to the catch. The secondary axis on your chart, the light gray line tracking the GDP deflator.
The inflation metric.
Yeah. And there are these stark, violent spikes upward in the data over the decades. You even drew these red circles around the most extreme spikes.
I did, yes, to highlight the volatility.
And you included a downward arrow there with a note saying high inflation erodes actual purchasing power.
Exactly. And we really need to understand the exact mechanics of why that is so devastating.
Break it down for us.
So the GDP deflator measures the changes in prices for all domestically produced goods and services. When that deflator spikes, meaning inflation is soaring, the local currency is effectively plummeting in value.
Right. So I want to make sure we ground this in reality for everyone listening. It's like, imagine you get a massive promotion at work.
Okay, great day.
Exactly. Your salary goes from $50,000 to $150,000. You run home, you're popping champagne, you think you've made it.
Natural.
But the next morning, you find out your rent just tripled, your grocery bill quadrupled, and gas is 10 times more expensive.
Right.
The number on your paycheck went up, sure, but mathematically, you are actually poorer than you were before the promotion.
That is precisely how it works. When inflation outpaces GDP growth, the macroeconomic boom is just a phantom.
It's just numbers on paper.
Exactly. The average citizen in the Gambia doesn't experience a $2 billion economy.
Mm.
They experience the cost of a bag of rice doubling in a matter of months.
Which is terrifying.
It is. But the damage goes so much deeper than just the grocery store. This volatility in purchasing power destroys the very concept of savings.
Because if your money is losing value every day, keeping it in a bank account is basically setting it on fire.
Right. If inflation is at 20% and your savings account yields 2%, you are losing 18% of your wealth every year just by holding cash.
That's brutal. So what do people do?
They don't save. They buy physical assets, or they just spend it immediately to survive. And without domestic savings, the banks have no capital to lend out to local businesses.
Oh, wow. So local entrepreneurs can't get loans to expand.
They cannot. Furthermore, how do you write a 5-year business plan when you have absolutely no idea what your currency will be worth next year?
You can't. It's impossible.
Investment planning becomes essentially gambling.
Mm-hmm.
And for the government, attempting to forecast a national budget to build roads or schools becomes a nightmare.
So the purchasing power erosion just sets up this foundation of sand for everything else the country is trying to build.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which leads us to the structural makeup of the economy itself on slide 4.
Yes, the industrial structure. You brought in this really fascinating stacked area chart. Very muted colors, low saturation grays, blues, and greens.
To keep the focus on the data boundaries.
Right. And there is a massive anomaly here. Over the decades, the agricultural sector has basically stagnated, hovering around that 20 to 30% mark of the GDP.
Well, the service sector has completely taken over.
Yeah. You have this solid arrow pointing to the widest part of the chart, noting that services broke past the 50% threshold to become the dominant pillar of the economy.
This is where we see the phenomenon of premature deindustrialization.
Premature deindustrialization. Okay, unpack that.
Traditionally, if you look at the textbook path of economic development, think of the Asian tigers or the Industrial Revolution in the West.
Right, the standard model.
Yeah. A country moves from agrarian farming to heavy industrial manufacturing, and then finally to a service-based economy.
Wait, I have to stop you there and push back a little, because I hear service economy and I think of like the US or the UK.
Right, advanced economies.
Yeah, tech, finance, consulting. Isn't shifting to services what modern advanced economies do? Why is this a red flag for the Gambia?
Because of how they arrived at that service economy. When a fully developed nation transitions to services, they are building a penthouse on top of a massive pre-existing foundation of industrial wealth.
Okay, I'm tracking.
They spent decades, sometimes centuries, manufacturing physical goods. That manufacturing era built their middle class, funded their power grids, and accumulated massive domestic capital.
So they built the bedrock first.
Exactly. And the services they eventually transition into are high value. Software engineering, global finance, advanced medical research.
Ah, I see. They earned the transition.
They did. But when a developing nation like the Gambia skips the manufacturing phase and goes straight to services, they were trying to build the penthouse with no foundation.
Just floating in midair.
Yeah. The data you provided shows high-tech manufacturing, or really any substantial industrial manufacturing, is practically non-existent.
Lingering in the low single digits.
Exactly. They completely skip the factory floor.
So what does a service economy look like without a factory floor?
Well, it looks like informal, low-wage labor. We aren't talking about software engineers here. We are talking about small-scale retail, informal street vendors, basic transportation.
Like driving a taxi or running a small market stall.
Right, and low-tier hospitality. These sectors do not have the same productivity multipliers as a factory.
What do you mean by multipliers?
Well, a worker in an informal market stall is not gaining the technical skills or the wage growth that a worker on an automated assembly line would.
That makes sense.
So the economy simply cannot absorb lower-skilled labor into high-productivity roles.
And if you aren't manufacturing anything domestically, but your population is growing and demanding consumer goods, you have to buy it all from the outside.
Which brings us to the trade data on slide 5. It is the unavoidable mathematical consequence of premature deindustrialization.
The numbers on this slide are staggering. It's a positive-negative bar chart. Gray bars above the zero line for exports, dark blue bars below for imports.
And the gap between them is the deficit.
Right. And you place this massive red bracket at the bottom of the deepest bars, highlighting a structural trade deficit that has blown past the $1 billion mark.
The imports are just entirely dwarfing the exports.
Over $1 billion.
Think about the mechanics of a country with no industrial base. They have to import heavy machinery. They have to import processed foods.
Basically everything manufactured.
Right. Almost all of their fuel and refined energy products, consumer electronics, vehicles, even basic construction materials.
Wow.
And as the population grows, the demand for these imports is rigid and massive. You can't just stop importing fuel.
But what are they actually exporting to pay for all of this?
Primarily basic agricultural products like peanuts and some services like tourism.
That doesn't seem like a fair trade.
It's not. And agricultural exports are incredibly vulnerable. A bad rainy season or shifting global commodity prices, and your export revenue just collapses.
So you have a situation where the import bill is massive and non-negotiable, and the export revenue is small, volatile, and low value.
Exactly. That structural imbalance, that billion-dollar gap, it literally means $1 billion of wealth is bleeding out of the country every single year.
Just evaporating from the local autonomy?
Yes. And to pay for those imports, the country constantly has to sell its own currency to buy foreign reserves, usually U.S. dollars.
Right, to pay the international vendors.
Exactly. And this constant selling pressure on the local currency drives its value down, which feeds right back into the massive inflation spikes we discussed at the very beginning.
Oh, wow. It is a vicious closed loop cycle.
It really is.
And the pressure inside that loop is just intensifying at an alarming rate because of the demographics. The data you shared on slide 6 is intense.
The population dynamics.
Yeah. You have this combination infographic, a smooth line chart showing the population density skyrocketing from 40 people per square kilometer in the early years to over 242 people per square kilometer recently.
With an upward arrow denoting that the carrying capacity is under severe pressure.
Right. Multiplying the density by 6 over a few decades is a shock to any system. But you noted it's not just the raw number of people, it's who those people are.
The youth bulge.
Yeah, the right side of the infographic has this matrix of 100-person icons, and you shaded almost all of them to show a youth dependency ratio hovering between 70 and 90%.
This is one of the most defining statistics in the entire deep dive.
It's unbelievable.
The youth dependency ratio measures the number of children and young people, typically under age 15, relative to the working age adult population.
So a 90% ratio means?
It means that for every 100 working age adults, there are 90 dependents relying on them for absolute survival.
I want the listener to really visualize the math of that. Imagine a household where 2 working parents have to fully support, feed, clothe, and educate almost 2 children on just their wages.
Right.
But in an economy with rampant inflation and no high-paying factory jobs.
It is a recipe for extreme capital starvation. We
Yeah.
talked earlier about the lack of domestic savings due to inflation.
Yeah.
Well, this demographic reality compounds that problem exponentially. If a tiny fraction of working-age adults are carrying the financial burden for a massive population of children, they simply cannot save a single cent.
Every dollar earned goes immediately to basic caloric survival.
Exactly. Which means no local investment.
None at all.
And it scales up to the national level, too. The government has to direct massive amounts of its limited budget just to provide basic food subsidies, primary schooling, and rudimentary health care for this exploding youth population.
So they can't look to the future.
No, they are forced into a posture of constant crisis management rather than long-term strategic investment. They can't build a deep-water port or a high-speed rail network because they have to buy grain to feed the youth bulge.
It's like trying to sprint a marathon while carrying 4 people on your back.
That's a very accurate analogy.
But wait, I hear economists talk all the time about the demographic dividend. Isn't a massive youth population supposed to be a country's greatest asset? Like a huge, energetic workforce ready to build the future.
That is the great theory, yes. But a demographic dividend is not automatic. It is merely a window of opportunity.
Okay, so how do you cash it in?
It only becomes a true dividend if 2 things happen. First, you must equip that youth population with high-level skills.
Right, education.
And second, your economy must have modernized enough to provide them with productive, high-wage jobs when they actually enter the workforce.
Which goes back to the factories.
Exactly. If you have the youth bulge, but you skip the industrialization phase and have no factories, and you can't afford to educate them properly,
Then it's not a dividend, it's a massive burden.
it becomes a profound dependency burden that strains the social fabric to its absolute breaking point.
And we see that strain immediately when we look at the public health data you provided on slide 7.
The mortality data.
Yeah, this section is a study in paradoxes. On one hand, there is a massive undeniable victory shown on this step chart. You have a green downward arrow highlighting a sharp, sustained decline in the under 5 mortality rate over the decades.
It is a genuine triumph of modern medicine and global health initiatives. The neonatal and under 5 mortality rates have absolutely plummeted.
Which means what, practically?
It means vaccination campaigns, the distribution of anti-malarial bed nets, and basic treatments for diarrheal diseases have been successfully implemented. Medical intervention clearly works.
But then you put a gray circle on the chart around the maternal mortality data, the long, tragic, persistent tail.
Yes, the absolute death rate and the lifetime risk for mothers remain a severe crisis.
This is what I just don't understand. If we have the logistics to vaccinate the infants and save them from malaria, why are we failing so badly to save the mothers?
This is where we have to distinguish between targeted interventions and systemic infrastructure.
Okay, explain the difference.
Vaccinating a child is a targeted intervention. It is relatively straightforward, logistically self-contained, and highly scalable.
Right.
You can literally fly the vaccines in on a cargo plane, load them into a refrigerated truck, set up a pop-up clinic in a rural village, administer the shots, and significantly drive down infant mortality without needing to alter the underlying economy of the village at all.
It's essentially just a supply chain problem. You move the box from point A to point B.
Exactly. And global aid organizations are very, very good at supply chain problems.
Yeah.
But saving a mother who is experiencing complex hemorrhaging or obstructed labor during childbirth is an entirely different order of magnitude. You cannot parachute in a solution for that.
So what does it actually require?
It requires robust, deeply rooted systemic healthcare infrastructure.
Like physical buildings?
Buildings, yes, but also a paved road network so an ambulance can actually reach a rural clinic in time. It requires a functioning hospital with a sterile surgical theater.
Wow.
It requires a reliable 24/7 electrical grid to keep an emergency blood bank viable. And crucially, it requires highly trained surgeons, obstetricians, and anesthesiologists.
Who need to be paid.
Right, permanently staffed and paid a competitive wage so they don't just emigrate to Europe.
Oh, wow. I see it now. The maternal mortality rate isn't just a health metric. It's a proxy for the entire physical and institutional infrastructure of the country.
Precisely. The Gambia has mastered the targeted interventions funded by global aid, but they are hitting a brick wall when it comes to building the systemic infrastructure required to handle complex medical care.
And that lack of systemic infrastructure bleeds into other areas of health too, as you showed on slide 8.
The malnutrition and infectious disease data.
Right. You used a 2-panel trellis chart. On the left, it shows persistent, severe issues with malnutrition, specifically high rates of stunting and wasting in children under 5.
And on the right, persistent HIV infection rates, especially among young females.
You even added horizontal benchmark lines showing just how far these metrics are from global health targets.
The stunting data is particularly alarming. It is one of the most economically devastating metrics in this entire data set.
Why is that?
Because stunting isn't just about a child being short for their age. It is a physical manifestation of chronic, severe malnutrition during the most critical years of brain development.
So it's not just physical growth, it's cognitive development too.
Yes, if a child's brain does not receive the necessary proteins and micronutrients in the first 1,000 days of life, the cognitive impairment is permanent.
Wait, permanent? It can't be fixed later.
It cannot be reversed later with better food.
Yeah.
The damage is done. This means their future ability to learn complex tasks, their future earning potential, and their ability to contribute to that hypothetical demographic dividend.
Is permanently destroyed before they even set foot in a primary school.
Exactly. The economic cost of stunting, measured in lost future GDP, is absolutely astronomical.
That is heartbreaking. And it brings us to slide 9, which shows a massive disparity in how people are actually living day to day.
The infrastructure inequality.
Yeah, you used a dumbbell plot connecting urban and rural data points. And while access to basic drinking water has seen some broad improvement, the gap in rural sanitation is staggering.
It really is.
The data shows rural access to basic sanitation facilities historically lagging terribly, sometimes hovering below the 50% mark. You put a double-sided arrow there labeled unequal distribution of infrastructure dividends.
It visualizes the divide perfectly. The wealth generated by that $2 billion GDP we discussed earlier is highly concentrated in urban centers, while the rural periphery is largely left to fend for itself.
Okay, I have to channel the skeptical listener here for a second.
Go for it.
If the GDP is hitting $2 billion and they are ostensibly receiving millions in international aid, why is it so hard to build a toilet in a rural village?
Right.
I mean, we aren't talking about quantum computing infrastructure here. We are talking about basic sanitation. Why is the rural population being left so far behind?
It's a completely valid question, and the answer is rooted in a concept called resource dilution.
Resource dilution, okay.
We have to connect this back to the demographic data on slide 6.
Mhm.
When your population density is exploding from 40 to over 240 people per square kilometer.
The sheer volume of people.
Exactly. The absolute sheer volume of human need is expanding at an exponential rate.
So the pie is growing, but the number of people demanding a slice is growing faster.
That's exactly it. Even if the government's tax revenue increases by 5% in a given year, if the population requiring sanitation, water, and schools grows by 6%, the actual resources available per capita shrink. The money is spread impossibly thin. Attempting to build infrastructure in that environment is like pouring a single glass of water into a bathtub. It simply vanishes across the vast surface area of need.
Resource dilution. That is a powerful concept. And honestly, it transitions us perfectly into the most glaring example of resource dilution in this entire deep dive.
The education sector.
Yes, slide 10. You provided data on the educational capital of the nation, and it presents a massive, almost dangerous illusion.
I call it the enrollment mirage.
It's a great term for it because the dual axis chart here shows the gross enrollment ratio for primary schools shooting up as a bar chart, breaking past 100% in some years.
Which looks fantastic on paper.
Right. If you just read the headline, you'd think, incredible, every single kid in the country is in school, plus some. But then you drew this black circle on the secondary axis, the line chart.
Showing the absolute numbers.
Yeah. Despite 100% gross enrollment, the absolute number of out-of-school children actually peaked at over 110 to 120,000 kids. How is that mathematically possible?
It comes down to how gross enrollment is calculated by international institutions. It is a deeply flawed metric if viewed in isolation.
How so?
Gross enrollment measures the total number of students enrolled in a specific level of education, regardless of their age, and expresses that as a percentage of the official school-age population for that level.
So wait, if primary school is officially for ages 6 to 11, the denominator is the total population of 6 to 11-year-olds in the country.
Correct.
And the numerator is literally anyone sitting in a primary school classroom.
Exactly. Regardless of age, in developing nations with high poverty rates and a historical lack of access, you have massive numbers of overage children.
What does that look like in practice?
You have 14-year-olds who are just starting first grade because their rural village finally got a teacher. Or you have children who had to repeat multiple grades due to illness or having to work on the farm.
Ah, so you have 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds artificially inflating the numerator, pushing the ratio over 100%.
Yes.
Meanwhile, 120,000 actual 6 to 11-year-olds are entirely out of the system.
Precisely. It's like boasting that your restaurant is operating at a 110% capacity, taking photos of the packed dining room for your investors, but completely ignoring the massive line of 100,000 hungry people standing outside on the sidewalk.
Because you simply don't have enough tables for them.
Exactly.
And what about the kids who are inside the restaurant? What kind of meal are they actually getting? Because the data you shared on education efficiency on slide 11 is brutal.
This is where resource dilution physically destroys human capital.
Use a scatter plot here of people-teacher ratios and put a dashed box around the upper quadrant.
Because the push for universal enrollment largely driven by political goals and international targets, resulted in cramming students into the system without the fiscal capacity to hire, train, and pay enough qualified educators.
So the data points inside that dashed box represent incredible extremes.
You end up with scenarios where there are 50, 60, sometimes 70 children in a single classroom with one teacher.
I literally cannot even imagine that. What does a teacher even do in that environment?
Mostly, they manage crowd control.
It's like keeping them quiet.
Right. They certainly cannot facilitate high-level cognitive development, critical thinking, or complex problem solving. They are forced into rote memorization drills just to maintain order.
So the government gets to check a box that says a child is in school, the international enrollment metric goes up.
But the actual learning gets
Exactly.
once.
Which ruins everything we talked about earlier.
Exactly. We go back to the overarching narrative, the structural shift. If the Gambia wants to transition away from basic agriculture and informal street vending and move toward high-value manufacturing or advanced services.
They need an incredibly skilled workforce.
Yes. And a 100% enrollment rate in overcrowded, massively under-resourced schools will never produce that workforce.
It's just signaling. They're building the appearance of an education system without the actual transfer of knowledge.
It is deeply unfair to those kids.
It really is. You're raising their expectations without giving them the actual tools to succeed in a modern economy.
It is an illusion of progress that masks a complete stagnation in human capital.
And the costs of this specific model of growth aren't just limited to human capital. There are severe physical and institutional costs. Let's look at slide 12, the environmental toll.
The natural capital data.
Yeah, use these cool little spark lines. The bottom one shows absolute carbon dioxide emissions rising, which I guess is somewhat expected for a rapidly growing population.
Yes, though per capita it remains low.
But the top spark line is the really alarming one. You put a red upward arrow on the net forest depletion chart. It's just accelerating.
And we must connect this back to the demographic pressure cooker from slide 6.
Right, the density.
When your population density multiplies by 6, and you have hundreds of thousands of people largely excluded from the formal, modernized economy, how do they survive?
They have to rely on the immediate land around them.
Exactly. More people means more demand for arable land, leading to massive deforestation for subsistence farming.
Just clearing trees to plant basic crops.
Yeah. Furthermore, because the systemic infrastructure is weak, meaning there is no reliable national power grid reaching rural areas, a vast majority of the population relies on biomass for daily survival.
Meaning wood.
They cut down trees for wood and charcoal just to cook their food and boil their water.
So the economic growth we are seeing on the GDP chart is actually cannibalizing the physical environment. They're burning their natural capital just to survive the day.
It is a fundamentally unsustainable trajectory. The carrying capacity of the land is being structurally compromised. You noted the text box I added there.
Yeah, natural capital overdraft requires policy alarm. It's incredibly stark, which begs the ultimate question, who is managing this?
Who is steering the ship?
Exactly. And the data you provided on institutional governance on slide 13 is, frankly, the most sobering part of this entire deep dive.
The World Governance Indicators.
Yes, the WGI. These horizontal bar charts measure things like rule of law, control of corruption, and regulatory quality.
And if we look at where the Gambia ranks globally on these metrics,
they are entirely stuck in the bottom third. You drew this dashed vertical line representing the global median, the 50th percentile.
And the solid dots for the recent years.
They are all way to the left of that line. They're essentially getting failing grades across the board in how the country is run.
This is the governance ceiling. It's the final immovable bottleneck that restricts absolutely everything else we've discussed today.
How so?
Well, we have to understand exactly how bad governance physically stops economic development. Let's take regulatory quality and rule of law.
Right. How do those abstract metrics translate to the real world?
Let's go back to the missing factory floor from our discussion on premature deindustrialization. Building a heavy manufacturing base requires massive amounts of capital.
Capital that the Gambia does not have domestically.
Exactly, because of the dependency ratio and inflation. Therefore, they absolutely must attract foreign direct investment, or FDI. A foreign company needs to come in and build the factory.
Okay, so let's say a foreign manufacturer wants to build a $50 million processing plant.
But before they invest a single dollar, they look at the rule of law metric.
And they see it's failing.
Right. If that metric is in the bottom tier globally, the foreign manufacturer knows that if the local government suddenly decides to seize their factory Or if a local supplier breaches a massive contract, the foreign company has no reliable legal recourse in the local courts.
The risk of expropriation is just way too high.
Exactly. And then they look at control of corruption. If a foreign company knows, they will be forced to pay exorbitant bribes just to get their factory connected to the local power grid, or to get their goods through customs at the port.
The transaction costs of doing business become mathematically prohibitive.
So what do?
They walk away.
They take their $50 million to a more stable emerging market in Asia or Eastern Europe. The factories are never built, the jobs are never created, the youth bulge remains unemployed.
Wow.
Poor governance acts as an invisible force field repelling the exact capital the country desperately needs.
It's an absolute chokehold, and whatever money the government does manage to scrape together is being siphoned off by the final crushing weight in this data. The debt squeeze on slide 14.
The fiscal trap.
Yeah, you used a waterfall chart combined with an area chart here. It shows official development assistance international aid flowing into the country. But immediately it is washed right back out by massive debt servicing requirements.
Particularly multilateral debt.
Yeah, you put a reverse arrow there pointing out how debt repayment is crushing their fiscal space. This brings everything full circle. Early on, you asked why they couldn't just build rural sanitation with a $2 billion GDP.
Right. Where is the actual money going?
It is going straight to creditors.
The concept we need to focus on here is fiscal space. Fiscal space is the room a government has in its budget to provide resources for public purposes, like health, education, and infrastructure, without endangering the sustainability of its financial position.
And the data shows their fiscal space is practically non-existent.
Because sovereign debt obligations take absolute priority. If a nation defaults on its multilateral debt to institutions like the World Bank or the IMF, it faces total economic isolation.
They get blacklisted.
It gets locked out of global financial markets entirely. So the government must pay the interest and principal on its foreign debt before it pays for anything else.
Leaving literal pennies on the dollar for the citizens.
Precisely. Why are there 70 kids in a classroom with one teacher? Why is the maternal mortality rate still a crisis?
Because there's no money left.
Exactly. Because whatever domestic tax revenue the government collects and whatever international aid flows in is aggressively eaten up by debt servicing. The government simply does not have the unencumbered capital to invest in systemic infrastructure.
So it's a double whammy. You have no money because of the massive debt burden, and the little money you do have is managed poorly because of weak governance and corruption.
That is the grim reality of the macroeconomic illusion.
Okay, let's take a collective breath here. That is a heavy, heavy diagnosis.
It's a lot to take in.
We've looked at the inflation eroding wages, the lack of factories, the crushing demographics, the illusion of education, and the chokehold of bad governance and debt. The X-ray is showing multiple compounding fractures.
Yes.
But the beauty of a rigorous deep dive like this is that it doesn't just admire the problem. The final part of your data, slide 15, provides a blueprint, a series of policy insights and systemic recommendations.
And it is vital to understand that this blueprint is not a menu where policymakers can just pick and choose what sounds easiest.
Right. It's a clean, 3-column text grid with bold arrows emphasizing execution priority. It's a strict sequence.
Exactly.
Let's walk through the 3 pillars. Pillar 1 is economic decarbonization and industrial diversification, meaning they have to break their reliance on volatile agriculture and low-end informal services while stopping the destruction of their forests.
They have to move up the value chain.
Yeah.
Instead of exporting raw agricultural products, they need to build the capacity to process and package those goods domestically.
Right, value add.
They need to create a sustainable industrial base that actually adds value to their natural resources, rather than just extracting and burning them.
Pillar 2 is achieving a true demographic dividend, and the key one is true. The recommendation here is to completely shift the focus from raw enrollment percentages to the actual quality of education.
Because, as we established, an uneducated youth bulge is a dependency burden. To make that massive population of young people an asset, they need vocational training. They need technological literacy. They need critical thinking skills that map directly to the needs of a modernized economy.
Right.
You cannot build a modern industrial sector with workers who only know rote memorization from a classroom of 70 kids.
And pillar 3, the final pillar, reinforcing the governance foundation, elevating regulatory quality, violently cracking down on corruption, and establishing a firm rule of law to attract high-quality foreign direct investment.
And here's where the sequence becomes absolute. These three pillars are deeply, inextricably interdependent.
How so? Walk us through the dependency.
Think about the mechanics.
Mm.
You cannot achieve Pillar 1, diversifying the economy and building a modern industrial base,
Yeah.
without the educated, highly skilled workforce demanded by Pillar 2.
Because a factory requires engineers, managers, and skilled technicians.
Exactly. So Pillar 1 relies entirely on Pillar 2 succeeding. But you cannot achieve Pillar 2, building world-class schools, paying for highly trained teachers, and reducing class sizes, without massive amounts of fiscal space and foreign investment.
Right.
And as we just discussed, you will never get that fiscal space or that foreign investment unless you achieve Pillar 3.
Fixing the governance, stopping the corruption, and managing the debt.
Exactly. It all cascades back to governance.
If the foundation is cracked, the entire house falls down. You can build all the pop-up health clinics you want, and you can mandate 100% school enrollment, but until the legal and regulatory framework is secure, the structural transformation will always fail.
Governance is the linchpin of multidimensional development.
That brings us to the end of the data, and what an incredible, eye-opening journey it has been. I want to sincerely thank you, the listener, for providing such a phenomenal, data-rich presentation.
It really is a masterclass in empirical analysis.
It perfectly, and almost painfully, illustrates the deep interconnectedness of a nation's macroeconomy, its people, and its institutions. It proves that you can never just look at a GDP number or an enrollment statistic and claim you understand a country.
You really can't. You have to look past the headline numbers. And before we go, I want to leave you with one final thought for you to mull over.
Okay, lay it on us.
A thought that builds directly on the data we've analyzed today. We spent a lot of time discussing that 90% youth dependency ratio, the success in dropping the child mortality rate, and the massive push to get kids into schools.
Right, the youth bulge, the generation currently coming of age.
Yes. Consider the psychological reality of that specific generation.
What do you mean?
Well, what happens to the social fabric of a country when you successfully implement targeted medical interventions so that millions more children survive into healthy adulthood?
Which is a good thing.
It is. And then you successfully build enough basic infrastructure to put them all in a classroom, artificially raising their expectations for what their lives and careers can be.
Oh man, I see where this is going.
But the economy completely fails to industrialize to give them meaningful, well-paying jobs, and the crushing debt burden prevents the government from providing them with functional, systemic services.
Wow.
You have created a massive population of healthy, literate young adults with incredibly high expectations, but zero actual economic opportunity.
They are completely trapped.
They are. And that is not just an economic challenge. That is the ultimate ticking clock for the Gambia's political and social future.
Yeah.
A massive, unemployed, highly expectant youth population is the historical recipe for immense, explosive social unrest if those structural bottlenecks are not cleared.
That is a chilling but absolutely necessary thought to end on. It takes these abstract economic theories and makes the human stakes agonizingly clear.
It really does.
We are talking about the immediate futures of millions of people, and it brings us right back to our original paradox. This isn't a simple equation. It's a complex, multidimensional diagnostic challenge. But thanks to the rigorous data you brought to the table, the muddy waters are significantly clearer today.
It was a pleasure dissecting it with you.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the headline numbers, keep looking for the missing factories, and keep exploring the connections. We will see you next time.